Thank you so much, everybody, for coming. We're just going to get started. My name is Firdaus Al-Farouk. I also go by Danny. I'm senior editor at the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, so if you get this annoying newsletter called Regulatory Focus, that's me. My apologies. We will be talking about a really important subject today that I think you guys probably know, which is the TCET proposed notice that the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services has put out. But before we do that, I wanted to introduce my fellow panelists here. We've got Emily Murray on the end. We've got Donald Bobo. We've got Katie Meyer, and then we've got Akanksha Sharma. So I'm going to first of all start off with Emily and then go down the line. If you could talk about kind of your background, what you do, talk about how breakthrough products affect your world, and the importance of getting breakthrough products on the market.
Sure. Thank you very much. So, Emily Murray. And my background is I spent about 13 years working in Congress, in the U.S. House of Representatives, working for a variety of different members, including a California member, working for a caucus called the Republican Study Committee, working for a physician member of Congress, as well as working for McCarthy when he was whip and then leader. And what I did for him there was a variety of policy issues, including healthcare, sort of like the broad spectrum. So looking at everything where the federal government touches healthcare. Then after working for McCarthy, I then went to be the staff director of Ways and Means for Healthcare, where we then kind of drilled down in that focus to be more Medicare and health tax, and so no longer the FDA, CDC, that other part that another committee in Congress called Energy and Commerce Committee handles. So my background comes from where Congress interacts with both the administrative side and with industry and with stakeholders and patients, and trying to figure out how we can create policies and move them on the House floor through the Senate and get them enacted into law. Currently, I'm a partner at Tarplin Downs & Young, where we do just healthcare policy. We have multiple different clients in the healthcare space, and I think the way that the MCIT and then TCET is playing into what we do now is a lot of advocacy, working with Congress and CMS to try and find a path forward to kind of build on what they have done. And to do something that can be more meaningful in alignment with where many of the patients and industries are.
Great, thanks, Emily. Don Bobo, I'm a corporate vice president at Edwards Life Sciences. We're on the industry side in a company that's had the privilege of bringing a number of significant innovations to cardiovascular patients suffering from structural heart disease or valve disease. And we've had a chance to see the benefits of very innovative products, breakthrough products, get a national coverage decision, and we've seen how that has been an important element for these technologies to be made available to the entire Medicare population and all the way down to private insurance patients. And without that, we've also seen what happens when these get approved by the FDA and then they get stuck in Middle Earth where they're not approved, and you have to go negotiate with each of the regional MACs, and you see the real impact on patients. So this is something that we spend a lot of time thinking about and trying to partner with other stakeholders to make sure we get a great policy so some of these very meaningful innovations can get to patients. And glad to be on the panel.
Thanks, Don. I'm Katie Meyer. I lead government affairs and policy at Novocure. Novocure is a global oncology company. We're working to extend survival in some of the most aggressive forms of cancer. Our technology, our therapy is called Tumor Treating Fields, and it's delivered through a wearable home use medical device. We are approved to treat glioblastoma, brain tumors, and we invest very heavily in R&D in the hope to bring our therapy to patients with other types of cancer as well. So a very innovative new way of treating cancer, and we have sort of been through the ringer too on payment issues historically. And it took quite a while after our FDA approval to have Medicare coverage and Medicare patient access to our therapy for glioblastoma. And interestingly, we actually were successful with many of the major private payers before we got to Medicare. So we're so interested and supportive of the work that's ongoing to make some changes to modernize those payment systems so that they keep up with the technology innovations.
I'm Akanksha Sharma. I'm a physician. I'm a neuro-oncologist specializing in brain tumors and a palliative care specialist at Pacific Neuroscience Institute in Santa Monica. And I work in the Providence Health System, so it's a community hospital system, which is unique in its practice because we try to bring clinical trials to the community where a lot of the times they're in the academic centers. So in the work that I do, I treat glioblastoma, I treat gliomas, I treat cancers that spread to the body and to the brain from the body. And really at every step of the journey, there are considerations in terms of device. So from the time that they get diagnosed, we're looking at MRIs that that need to be updated, that have new technologies and new devices to help us better identify tumors. They go into surgery and there's devices there. We're working with a number of different devices in terms of getting the best surgical resection because so our patients can live longer, so they can do better after surgery without any deficits. And then they go through treatment, and we have a number of different treatments that utilize devices, including NovoCure. Then we get towards, even as they're progressing and getting worse from symptoms perspective, we are managing sometimes pain or other symptoms, and sometimes devices can be really helpful with that in terms of getting them meds through a peripheral source or getting a pump for medications or pain management. And so really at every point of our patient's journey, we are increasingly using devices more. And so it's something that I'm passionate about because I also noticed that the devices, the access to devices, the access to this type of care really is very disparate in our healthcare system and leads to inequities in healthcare, so, which is one of my areas of interest also as a palliative care specialist. So that I'm really honored to be on the panel. I have to disclose that NovoCure is giving me an honorarium to be here today.
Thank you. Before we move forward, I wanted to let you know I really want this to be a very interactive session, so I want people to start thinking about the kinds of questions you want to pose to these panelists here. You know, if you have any concerns about how TCET looks like today or how you'd want it to look like tomorrow, feel free to ask those questions. I'm going to start off, I want to ask you folks about what you are hoping to get out of this conversation. So let's start with Akanksha, and then we'll go down the line.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I feel a little bit like an outsider in terms of both an outsider and insider. So I understand the patient journey, and I'm very passionate about improving care for my patients. But from a policy and an industry perspective, I'm really still in the process of learning and understanding policy like TCET. Because one of the things that I hope to learn today is kind of learning more about how we think this policy will change the future of healthcare in our country in terms of access and early access, timely access, and also how it'll change access for patients who may not have the same payment ability as commercial insurance. So, you know, as an example, what my understanding and what we see on the ground is that it takes 5 to 8 years from a time of FDA approval for any device to really get to the patient, right? And then you're assuming that that's every patient, but it's really not. So within LA area, there are multiple zip codes, and where you live in that zip code, you will get access to devices because that decides sort of which hospital you go to, and is this hospital take your insurance? Are the surgeons aware of these devices? Are the doctors aware of these devices? Are they in, the commercial insurances that you have, will they cover these devices? So there's just, at every layer, there's disparities built into the system. And so I think this might be one way that we can at least improve access to patients, make the access faster, like reduce the time from when it's approved to when they get it. And then the fact that we can continue to collect data so that it can then feed into the process and help us improve that technology is also something that's very attractive to me. So I'm hoping to just learn more about that today.
Thanks, Danny. I'm hoping to have a really robust discussion about where CMS and the Congress might go in terms of implementing the TCET guidance, and also what additional changes Congress is looking at considering to build upon that guidance.
And just to build on the first two, I think if we, all of you, could come out of here with a higher level of awareness of where this process is and why it's so important to patients. I'll underscore the access issue. We see this repeatedly, depending on what zip code you're in. You've got easy access or very hard access to some of these therapies. And we sometimes end up in crazy conversations where the regulators on either side say, well, they're only 15 miles from a center, so that's enough access. Well, 15 miles in some zip codes is 4 buses and like a mile of walking, and most of these patients can't even do a 6-minute walk test. And so you say, well, that doesn't sound right. So how do we get our awareness up? And then the second one I think would be great is just to get alignment. So as we interact with CMS and encourage them in what they're proposing, and we think interact with Congress, we're able to kind of bring and elevate the important points that would allow those guys to act, as opposed to get confused because they're hearing so many different voices on different points.
I don't think I have too much different from what the other folks have said, but to maybe put a little finer point on that as it relates to kind of the congressional and administrative perspective. I do think it'd be really helpful to kind of see where there is, as you said, alignment, right? Where kind of stakeholders, patients, the community can come together and make a unified push to Congress, so that, like you said, that there's not multiple different niche ways that people want to kind of change and address the TCET guidance that they put out. Because when you are hearing from the administration or in Congress, everyone has a different perspective. It makes it pretty easy to do nothing. And so I think that would be helpful to see where are those core areas of agreement, and how can that message be reiterated over and over again to the right players to make sure either behind the scenes or publicly, Congress is making that push to move the guidance forward when they finalize it.
I want to kind of step back a little and look at how we ended up where we are today. So, Emily, could you talk to us a little about what the MCET rule was that was withdrawn? And then I'd like to ask Katie about what's in TCET. And then Dawn, I'd like to get your perspective on how the two differ.
Sure. And I might even take a little bit further step back in terms of why we ended up getting the MCIT rule in the first place. And I think even going back to my personal experience at the Ways and Means Committee, where we heard from numerous different stakeholders, device makers, patient groups on the growing concern about, call it the valley of death, or CMS inaction and the long wait that they would see if they were even able, to get coverage, then what that reimbursement looked like. It was something that we would hear over and over and over again. And a lot of the key members, so the chairman who ran that committee, multiple different chairmen throughout the years, really wanted to figure out what can we do to try and act on this. And I think Congress stepping out and sort of updating very old and to some extent outdated policies for how you look at Medicare coverage is difficult for Congress to do. I don't know, they're really functional right now, so it's difficult for those sorts of things to get through. But one thing they did know is that the pressure that Congress can apply and to work with CMS as they're looking at this can make a lot of difference. And so I think stepping back, there was a lot of bipartisan congressional interest in trying to see, as we look at new and innovative devices, how can we update how we view, how we cover, and how we reimburse this. And so a lot of behind the scenes engagement occurred for years leading up to the Trump administration putting out the MCIT rule. And so I'm sure lots of stakeholders in this room and the government affairs folks also had a lot of those similar conversations to try and find a way within CMS's authority to sort of create an expedited temporary process. And so that culminated in the Trump administration putting out the MCIT rule. And so again, a rule has more weight behind it than guidance. And so they put that forward But the timing of them doing so was such that it was at the end of the administration, and so it allowed for like a look back period for the Biden administration to kind of pull back different regulations that hadn't been moved forward earlier. And so, on what the MCIT was, it was a guaranteed pathway, a temporary pathway, if you were a FDA breakthrough designated device, that you would get this temporary coverage. And that was kind of it, right? This is what was going to happen. You knew you had certainty. You knew that you would have it. And they just really relied on the FDA's determination. So maybe kind of fast forward, once it was rescinded, the Biden administration had said, look, we understand that there's a lot of interest, a lot of support for this, and we also know that we need to do something. But we have concerns with, and this is sort of the way that CMS often operates, is that we are a separate entity and that we have different things we want to take into account beyond the FDA. We want to know, how does this impact seniors specifically? We want some additional data, and they sort of raised that as a concern, for one of the concerns for why they wanted to pull it back before putting forward a new regulation. So maybe then I can Katie for a little more on that.
Yeah, that's right, Emily. So after the guidance the rule was withdrawn, CMS said we need to do this. They took a couple years and collected stakeholder feedback, excuse me, in the summer put out the transitional coverage of emerging technologies guidance. And that would allow a product that receives breakthrough designation, but the definition of those products is much more narrow than all breakthrough products, to go through the national coverage determination process and likely get a coverage with evidence development to have more data collected on the product. There are some timelines in the guidance around how quickly that would happen, which would be generally more quickly than NCDs and CEDs are happening today. And CMS also said they only expected about 5 products per year to go through this new pathway.
So several differences, I think, are meaningful to just moving innovations to patients. I think an MCET, it was 4 years, and if you were breakthrough, everybody got it. In TCET, it's max 5. Definition's a lot more narrow, and I'll say statements around what they hope the timing would be, but no guarantees, no commitments, none of that. And as an industry participant, as someone who's had a chance to see a lot of innovation go forward, it just comes across, I guess, from a patient perspective on 2 levels. One, I have no idea how you came up with 5 or why no timelines, right? So as if there's a budget to innovation. I mean, there's so much investment going in to breakthrough devices that felt arbitrary. I think the other side of that is there's probably real resource issues at CMS, and that's something I think that probably needs to get tackled at a congressional level. And then the definitional changes were significant, and so they're different, but we look at it and say, look, something would be great because it's a start. And then I think there are ways to build on that as this particular policy gets implemented, and then Congress gets engaged with. Probably the 2 of you can talk more specifically to that. So we view this as a good first step, but well short of what is needed by patients.
I do want to get back to the congressional piece of the puzzle, but first I want to go to Akanksha. Could you talk a little about the trends that you have seen with breakthrough devices over the years? How easy or how hard has it been to get those devices to your patients? And then I'd like to kind of go down the line and get all of your perspectives on what trends you're seeing with breakthrough devices.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think to answer that, I'm going to give you 2 examples of like Sonia and John. So Sonia lives in a zip code where there's she's kind of required to be on a certain HMO. There's limitation in care. There's not access to a big level hospital, and they both get diagnosed with brain tumors. And John is in a different area where there's multiple hospitals, 3 or 4 academic centers near him. He can go to multiple centers to get opinions. And so the journey of both these patients will be really different. So what I would think and what I've seen over the years has been that someone like Sonia will get a seizure, will have a seizure, will get hospitalized, will be diagnosed with a brain tumor, will go into surgery. In each of these steps, if there was access to new groundbreaking technology, new devices, most likely there would not be an option for that. And that multiple reasons, as I kind of hinted to before. One will be the insurance that Sonia has. It might be the hospital doesn't have that level of specialty. It might be that the surgeons or the oncologists involved in the care aren't even aware of these technologies. Versus if they're John, who's going to these academic centers, will say, hey, we have this new device that will be able to suck out all the tumor intraoperatively. We have this new device that's going to highlight all the tumor cells when we look under the microscope. We have a center that has an intraoperative MRI. So when we do the surgery, we'll know exactly where your tumor is. So now who has the better start to their glioblastoma journey? It's going to be John versus Sonia, right? And then that kind of continues down that path. So I have seen a lot of exciting new innovations for patients over the last 10 years. Everything from wearable devices that will track their health and be able to have them communicate with their doctors rapidly, to things like NovaCure, which is changing the trajectory. Average survival for a patient who wears a tumor treating fields has improved 6 months. That's more than any other treatment for glioblastoma, which generally has an average survival of 16 to 18 months. And I will say that it's a very difficult journey, and to have a treatment that is not invasive can be very helpful. And then there are also devices such as radiation therapies that reduce toxicity in the long term, which is really important if we're trying to get someone more time. Or there are now AI integrated technology that can help patients with monitoring of their symptoms, with access to their teams. So all of these devices are out there. They're very exciting. They're very new. But what I notice above all is that I know this patient can get it and this patient can't. And I know that the patients I'm seeing are even told about this, but there are many centers and I get patients for second opinions all the time who've never heard of most of these options. And so there are new breakthroughs, there's new devices, I think, that can change the face of cancer care in this country, but there's definitely an issue of cost, availability, and access.
Dr. Sharma, it was exciting to hear you talk about all those innovations. I'm focused on one, and I think in particular what we've been thinking about at NovaCure is the emergence of device-based therapies and how different that is from the traditional drug-based therapies, and frankly how device-based therapies weren't really considered by the Medicare program when the payment systems were put in place. So it's not just cancer devices, it's also other products, continuous glucose monitor, you're treating a patient at home or delivering the treatment at home, things that might be possible like home hemodialysis, and other things that maybe haven't been commercialized yet because there's unclear payment pathways for these products. They can be categorized as durable medical equipment, and the payment pathway for that is extremely challenging. So we believe that there's actually been underinvestment in this kind of innovation because of these the existing payment pathways especially through the Medicare program. And we think that there's potential for these policy changes to lead to additional innovation, and that's very exciting for patients.
Yeah, both, I think, great examples. One of the things that we have experienced and continue to see is so much of the innovation has quite frankly outstripped the original statutory framework and work that was done, I don't know, whenever this was done, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And how do we get these rules in the CMS and kind of the statutory basis for these updated so that it rewards the kind of innovation that we're able to deliver today? At Edwards, many of our innovations are going to be, for the first time, therapies are available for patients who are suffering from a disease that prior heretofore was not treated or not treatable. And that creates a real dilemma to some of these payment systems and regulatory processes because it wasn't contemplated or anticipated. It's brand new. Now, the FDA has actually, over the last 10 or 15 years, come a long way to match their system and their regulation with innovation. And, there's a ton of hard work, both at Congress and with stakeholders, to partner with them to get there. And it's actually one of the bright spots in a kind of a government involvement in innovation where it actually goes pretty well from our perspective. How do we get a CMS process and a payment process so it's able to be as agile, as collaborative, as involved, so that these innovations that 20 years ago were unthinkable, like you mentioned, Katie, so many things we can now deliver therapies in the home. 20 years ago, we never thought about that. You had to go someplace to get it. That should be as respected, as valuable to the patients and the people who are investing in it as some of the therapies we deliver in hospitals. So these are a couple of example areas where, for Edwards and many of our peer companies in the same space, just getting that piece of the innovation payment more aligned with how it gets regulated by FDA would be a huge step forward for patients, for access, and for ability to treat many of these diseases.
Maybe just a little bit on, what we did. So breakthrough is actually something that Congress was in a bright spot, right? Something that they were able to do, and a lot of work done years ago as you looked at 21st century cures and sort of, phase one. And a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of that was really focused on the FDA side and not on the reimbursement side or the Medicare side. And so, it was a great starting point, and I think something where there was a lot of bipartisan support. But I think the struggle has been, okay, once you have this breakthrough designation or once you have this pathway at FDA, how does that translate to what CMS does with it? And again, separate entities, and that's kind of always been the friction that occurs. And so Congress has wanted to try and find a way to address like the step two. And so that's where you've seen, there was kind of Cures 2.0, which there was some effort behind doing. And then ultimately, I think you saw with the MSIP proposal, right, trying to find a way to continue to each step to kind of fix it versus the one-offs that you would see. So even though they made the big changes on the FDA side, everything else was sort of piecemeal, individual coverage as you try to find a path forward with CMS. So I think that's maybe the only other piece I'd add.
Yeah, and I just want to circle back to, I think, highlight something that Katie said and we all kind of touched on, is that it's a cyclical pattern. So like there's so many unanswered pieces in healthcare, so many things that patients need, and there could be solutions for it, but they're discouraged essentially because there's this idea of like, well, how will this actually get, patients ask me, why do I need to get poked so much? Why isn't there an easier way for me to get infused? My phone is this small, but in 2023, you're still treating me like a pincushion. Or they say, why do I have to come to the hospital for these infusions? Isn't there a better way that I can do this at home? Isn't there a pump I can wear? And we have a pump for some chemos, but not for a lot of them because that device process has not been figured out because there's not an advantage to it. There are innovators out there who are thinking, yes, I could do this, but what will be the process for me to actually get through and get it to the patient? And it's going to be so long and lengthy and expensive. And so it ends up, in the end of the day, this if we don't make that process easier, it staunches creativity and innovation and then hurts us at the end of the day.
That makes me think of an interesting issue, which is what kind of technologies are you seeing coming to market that are very much catered towards breakthrough technologies? FDA put out a guidance recently, actually put out a request for information recently on at-home use products. And there's a lot of promise where you're talking about access to treatments and diagnostics that has to be taken out of the hospital setting. What kind of technology are you seeing that might make that a reality? It would be, again, like I'm thinking of Dr. Califf recently talking about how there's so much extra cost in the U.S. healthcare system that if you had products that you could use at home without the need to put patients in the hospital or take them to the clinic, you would save a lot of cost. So what technology are you seeing out there? Anybody jump in, feel free to.
I'll jump in because one struck me as you were talking. Heart failure is probably the single biggest driver of Medicare cost today. And there's some very interesting technologies, some of which have been launched. They've been through multiple randomized clinical trials with positive results. And still yet today, there's not a unified coverage decision. And these are products that it's an implant. The patient can actually manage and monitor the heart failure episodically at home. And they've shown with that kind of management, you actually avoid hospitalization, avoid a ton of the cost. Yet we're probably 6 or 7 years into post-FDA approval, and it's on a list of 15 or 20 that one day somebody will go take a look at. So that's a perfect example. And if you talk to the patients, it's like, look, if I knew my daily pressure measurements, it would change how I did life, how I exercised, how I ate, how much salt I allowed myself to intake, et cetera. And those are things that to us are very simple because we're all aligned. If they were appropriately paid for and there was the incentive between the physician and patient to do this at home, you would net take real money out that year. So I think those are the kinds of examples, and I'll put a challenge back to our industry. These are the right ones for us to elevate, to say, hey, here's a case where if we do this, the government wins, the patient wins, the physician's happier because they're not having to see these patients on a periodic basis. And so there are a number of examples like that in structural heart that we think could be very, very powerful. It's just that somebody said it, the home use of these is just a path that hasn't been blazed. So we've got the people that are trying to pioneer it. You have to raise a significant amount of money to be able to stay the course because there just isn't the payment models.
And maybe I'll quasi-answer your question, but kind of going a little bit bigger. I do think that there's been a recognition in Congress that there can be savings achieved and that moving care when appropriate to the home makes sense, right? There's been targeted policies, whether you look at like a hospital at home program or you look at what they did with the mandatory ESRD demonstrations, where they try to figure out how you can move more dialysis to home, and tip knees. So there's been sort of other targeted approaches. But I think it's sort of the chicken or the egg, as you talked about, right? Like, how much are people going to invest in something if there's not a clear pathway or there's not something beyond just a temporary demonstration? And so I think that's been the big thing that's if we can't address it through administration actions, what can Congress kind of do to go bigger in incentivizing that?
I would build on that, Emily, and Danny, I can't speak about many other technologies than ours directly, but what I would say is some products will save money for the healthcare system by moving the site of care or reducing hospital readmissions or other things. Some products will increase the cost of the system because they make patients live longer, right? And I think we need to remember that that's part of the point of our healthcare system today too, is that there's value in that longer and higher quality of life.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of technologies to get, the question you asked is there's so many things that are on the horizon that I'm excited about. But what's funny is that there's so much that is already there that I just don't see enough of because of the payment structure and things like that. So for example, seizures are a common cause in patients with brain tumors. To identify those seizures, you have to do an EEG, which is an external electrode test. Most of the time you have to come into a clinic and do it, which changes your whole dynamic. You may be having seizures at home, but not when you come to the hospital. It changes. There's a lot of things that can just take you over the seizure threshold. You can do ambulatory EEGs where you wear it at home for 2 to 3 days instead of coming to the hospital and get hospitalized and monitored. But those are really hard to get from a coverage perspective, and so a lot of insurers don't like to approve those. The other area, that I think will be really exciting will be wearable devices. There are seizure watches. There are technology that can help loved ones know, oh, my loved one is having a seizure, so they don't have to stay up all night watching them and worrying about it, because seizure can be a cause of sudden death. And can be a cause of a lot of morbidity in these patients. And so seizure watches are out there. There's wearable devices that will help know like how your heart rate rises in response to treatment, and so you can go home and say, okay, I got my treatment and now I'm having some discomfort. Is it because of my heart rate? Is it because of my blood pressure? Is it because my heart went into a different rhythm? So there's all kinds of these technologies that are on the horizon that I'm really excited about. But then again, I worry like, will they, one, how long will it take before they come out? And two, when they are out, like the ambulatory EEG we've had for years, how can I actually get access to them?
Thank you. So I want to ask Emily, could you kind of go over the legislative solution now that we're looking at? There's a bill that's been introduced into the House Energy and Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means. Tell us what's in that bill, and also where does it stand currently in terms of being able to get passed?
Yes, so the bill is HR 1691, this Congress, but it's been around, as you said, for multiple years. It's something that originally was a Delbene-Walorski legislation, and then with the Congresswoman's passing, it's now been shifted to a Dr. Wenstrup from Ways and Means, and Delbene, Eshoo, and Guthrie. So you have kind of the key folks, leading on this in both Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means. So now that legislation, though, it's essentially a codification of the MSIT rule. And the reason for that is that it was introduced, when the Trump administration had put forward their regulation, before it had kind of been rescinded, before they came out with the TCET guidance, which is in many members' view short of what they were hoping CMS would put forward. So that is so that bill has been reintroduced and has lots of bipartisan co-sponsors. Has had the chairman and ranking members, support and interest in. But the kind of holdup or the question marks is now that you have, Biden administration putting out this TCET guidance, how does Congress want to react to that? And there's several ways that they've started to do that and are looking to do that moving forward this year. So first, several, probably 50 members, maybe more, would send letters to the administration pushing them to put out the guidance. Now you have members who are sponsors of the legislation working on letters right now to send to the administration, weighing in on the proposed guidance to the final version, right? Asking them these key questions that many people have talked about. We're concerned about the fact that only 5, devices per year. We're concerned that there's no enforcement timelines. We're concerned that it's not a distinct and separate guaranteed pathway. What should everyone go through an NCD with CED? What about those devices that have phase 3 clinical trials and have hard endpoints? Like, what about them? Is there a separate threshold for people that they don't have to go through this narrow pathway? So those are some of the questions that they are raising, either behind the scenes or publicly in their letters to the administration. And again, it's harder when if you're on the Democratic side, when your administration has put forward a proposal for you to publicly be seen as pushing back, right? So a lot more of that type of engagement would occur behind the scenes. So they've had multiple congressional staff briefings where they bring CMS in, and the staff of those committee get to ask those questions behind closed doors. And then they also have some of the more public-leaning ones where sometimes Republicans feel a little more emboldened to do that because it's not their administration. So that has led to, we've now had 2 hearings, congressional hearings, where this has come up, both MSIT and TCET. The first was early summer at the Ways and Means Committee, where the topic was access to Medicare innovation. And they covered a bunch of different things, and one of those pieces was what's happening with the yet-to-be proposed TCET guidance. So it was really kind of we want you to do something here, we're pushing you, we're concerned that this is limiting access by withdrawing it. And then you had, late in the summer, Energy and Commerce did a very similar hearing where it was probably a little bit more of a bipartisan tone after the guidance had come out to talk through what more needs to be done. And of course, this was coupled with a couple of other topics that they've been concerned about with CMS as well. So regular order is what the House has been committed to trying to do, is you have hearings and then you proceed to a markup. And so the next step that stakeholders and members have been trying to work through is what if any changes need to be made to this legislation that was introduced. And that's where starting where we said at the beginning, kind of trying to find a unified industry perspective, what are the things that most people can unite behind and to get bipartisan members, to push forward with. I think right now, part of the thinking has been, well, let's start with those strongest, legislation, the one that's out there, right? The one that codifies MSIT, and then look at that and say what needs to be dialed in order to get that cleared. So a couple of the potential hurdles for that is the cost. We have the Congressional Budget Office, and they score what different proposals will cost the federal government. And with MSIT being withdrawn and a narrower proposal put forward, now this legislation costs more money if you are to do it in Congress, right? Because it's not already baked into the baseline. So that's one of the things that they're trying to think through. Also trying to think through, do they continue to have the same amount of bipartisan support when this administration has done something short of that? And is there a way to also, unify behind that? And then I think the third thing is they're looking at, while breakthrough was the way that it was done through both administrations, is there a different definition that we could look at that brings in other types of devices but is still narrow? And so kind of trying to figure out that definition. So we're truly right now at the point where this month, if they weren't in a little bit of a standstill, the House was planning to try and move to do an additional committee activity on this. And so we'll have to kind of see the next couple of weeks, but they very much plan to try and act through committees and with the goal of trying to get something for end of the year discussions to pass on the floor. So.
Do you guys have anything to add to that?
The only thing I'd add, Emily did a great job summarizing the state of play and the future, is I was really glad to see the amount of bipartisan support for changes in this space, especially at that Energy and Commerce Medicare Innovation hearing that happened after the TCET guidance came out. There were a lot of pieces of legislation on the docket at that hearing, and this was the topic that dominated the conversation. And there was very strong bipartisan interest in getting something done that's broader, that's in the TCET guidance.
It warms the heart to know that we still can get lawmakers to work together, especially after the past couple of weeks. I want to kind of tap into that a little. What is the realistic possibility of the bill moving forward this year?
It's a great question. If you'd asked me a couple of weeks ago, it would have been more likely. But just sort of right now, without having a Speaker of the House, it does limit the floor activity. And so the longer that drags out and you don't have a Speaker elected, the harder it is, and you sort of get a backup of other legislation, including the kind of must-pass legislation or things that have an expiration date before the end of the year. Now, committees can continue to operate as they did, even if you don't have a Speaker. So that behind-the-scenes activity can still occur, but I do think that with some of the frustrations that have occurred cross-party with the motion to vacate, and sometimes politics come into otherwise bipartisan, there should be bipartisan policies. And so the question is, how much can committees move forward with bipartisan markups, or do they not have willing dance partners? And so that's the question mark that right now we truly don't know, because they're voting right now for if they have a new Speaker or not within their conference. So if that is to kind of be wrapped up in the next week or two, which is hopeful, then I do think there is still the ability to move onto markups of some sort of policy. Now you have to also align what Energy and Commerce does with what Ways and Means does, and they are communicating behind the scenes to try and make sure that they don't end up having a hold or keeping one committee's policy from moving forward. So they are trying to work together to make sure whatever they mark up is unified. So if you are able to get something cleared by October, maybe November, then I do think they'd like to if they can move something on the floor, that would very much be their preference. The other piece that comes into play, though, is in November we have the deadline for the current continuing resolution, or the short-term funding. And the real question is, will the government be shut down at that point if they haven't reached an agreement on the larger fiscal funding year appropriations? And I think everyone has been thinking that it's most likely that they will not reach an agreement between the House and the Senate on that continuing resolution. And a shutdown means that no other activity can move. So how realistic is it? I think we'll know in the next week or two will really, I think, play into that. And you know, even if we do get, there is a speaker in the House, and even if you do keep the government funded in November, I do think that if, you know, with new leadership, it does make it harder to do big deals and big packages. And I think something like this is most likely to get wrapped into something else versus being a standalone provision. And a large part of that has to do with the way the Senate operates and the inability to have floor time for dedicated pieces of legislation. So something like this would most likely have to get wrapped into a larger proposal, which makes it harder to see that happening at the end of this year.
No, I think that's exactly right. I mean, the only piece we haven't talked about is the Senate obviously would have to pass legislation as well for something to be enacted. There's been a lot of support in the Senate for this as well, but there hasn't been a bill introduced there. So I think that's largely because of the dynamic Emily was talking about, where Senate Democrats in particular are a little more hesitant to introduce legislation that could contradict something their own administration is doing. And the folks have thought it doesn't make sense to do this without having bipartisan support. So I think that is going to be a part of this process. Hopefully there's continued push in the House and then that will lead to continued activity in the Senate as well.
All right, so here's the fun part. This is a play your own adventure. You guys can go up to the mics. There's one on each side, so feel free to line up, and we'll start taking questions. Would you please introduce yourself before you ask your question?
Sure. Hi, I'm Chan Branham. Well, that's kind of loud. And I'm with Johnson & Johnson, but prior to joining Johnson & Johnson, I was with AdvaMed for 10 plus years. And folks that know me know that I really do have a passion for improving the processes around Medicare coverage and coding and reimbursement. I've worked on it for a long time, even before AdvaMed. And so I really do agree with the panel on a lot of the points that you're making on the challenges to coverage, coding, and reimbursement. I know they are many, but one thing that I didn't hear and that I always emphasize when I talk to groups or talk to people is that CMS really has a different statutory mission than the FDA, and that is to determine that new items and services are reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries. And I believe that CMS really takes that role seriously, and that they feel that they are protecting Medicare beneficiaries because they want to ensure that new products and services have evidence that supports that they improve outcomes in the Medicare population. So, but something that just occurred to me today was, as we look at legislation, I have never seen in the legislation, in any pieces of legislation, any effort to, maybe try to align those statutory missions. So right now they are very different, and so the legislation is really pushing this deference to the FDA, but CMS takes its own statutory mission very seriously. So I think it creates some tension, and I just wonder what folks think about that.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting questions. As a reporter, I kind of stand back and look at it, and it says coverage with evidence determination. Evidence is the key word. So, you're looking for data that not only supports, protecting the patients, but also the American taxpayer, because they're the ones ultimately fitting the bill. What potential, things would you add to the either TCET or the bill that's being considered right now to ensure CMS? Is there anybody from CMS here, by the way? Yeah, I didn't see anybody from CMS. It would be great to have you guys on here as well. But what would you potentially add to give CMS that assurance, like, hey, our product does work, and ultimately, if it turns out it doesn't work, you're not really losing money.
Yeah, it's a great question, and thanks, Chan. Thanks, Danny. I think as a company that relies on predictability for investments in new technology, we really appreciate seeing that clear pathway, right? And knowing what it is we have to do in order to be successful with the regulators. And I think that's where it has sometimes been difficult with the payers in particular. I do think with the legislation is likely to change. I don't think the final version will be an automatic pathway from FDA approval to automatic Medicare coverage. So I expect that's one place where, CMS will retain its authority to decide which products ultimately get paid, right? That's kind of the biggest thing. And I have to, say we would prefer it to be a lot clearer, but that's certainly, it's an important mission, and we obviously respect CMS's need to assure that products are reasonable and necessary as is statutorily required.
So a couple things I think become valuable to us. One is we respect the difference in mission between CMS and FDA. But part of what frustrates, I think, CMS's mission is a resourcing issue, because there are examples where there actually is quite extensive randomized data that's there. And even in conversations, there's a recognition and a willingness, but when you look at the resources to be able to clear NCDs, I don't know what the number is, I think there's north of 15 on a list. They've been on a list for many years. These are products that have come through pivotal trials. So I think not trying to pressure their mission, it's actually I think, a highly respected mission, but going at some of the other pieces that would allow them to actually execute the mission, like being resourced, having predictable criteria and pathways. Those are things, I think, that could be embedded either in legislation or a combination of legislation and the rules that would be a huge step forward. And I don't know that you have to go necessarily make their mission the FDA's mission. I think they're probably both have reasons to be different, but there are a number of things that we could do to take a lot of that friction out.
Yeah, and I think from a perspective of a healthcare provider and as a patient also myself, I think, that we obviously want to respect that mission that's very in line with how research in clinical world operates, right? We definitely want randomized controlled high evidence data. I think that exactly to your point is that there's a lag behind when that data comes out and when CMS suddenly says, oh, I'm aware of that. And now, I think the pandemic highlighted to us that it could happen faster, right? A lot of things happened very fast and we were kind of in shock as a healthcare community that this could actually happen. And there were very good trials done, not so good trials done also, but the good trials were able to get things through the FDA, through the CMS, but in regular real life, that process takes years. Like I'm still appealing things from Medicare constantly that there is data for that I have to send them papers and they're still like, nope, this is just not going to happen until there's new updates into what we know about it.
Again, echoing what everyone else said, I do think there has been a recognition in Congress too about sort of the separate roles, right? There has been throughout the years different proposals where you sort of unify if one covers automatically, the other does. But again, that push and pull on is that appropriate, and do we want to tie one agency's hands with another? And I think there's been concern with doing that. However, I think to Katie's point and others about if you have clear rules of the road earlier on and you know what CMS is going to want to see in order to have coverage for that Medicare population, then you can look at what types of trials and making sure you have enough Medicare population and they're making sure you have the right mix to ensure that you could then have a smoother glide path to having that covered versus having to do an NCD with CED, right? Like you could already kind of check those boxes on the front end. So I think there's some wiggle room in there and figuring out, do you legislate that or how much can CMS do on their own? So I think that's another area.
Yeah, I still think there are probably a lot of folks in the industry who wake up in cold sweat thinking about that Medicare advisory group after MCET came out and like, hey, FDA is doing CMS's job. And then that ultimately led to the withdrawal. Sir, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sure. So first, maybe to your point. So my name is Girish Pucha. I'm an independent consultant now, but before this, I was chief medical officer at a company called Freenome that uses AI for cancer screening. And before that, to the question you're asking, Danny, I worked at a Medicare administrative contractor doing local coverage decisions. determining coverage and reimbursement for molecular diagnostics in this case. So that brings me to sort of two questions that I'd have for the panel, and happy to have anyone take them. So the first one, which gets back to the point of the difference between safe and effective and reasonable and necessary in the missions, is really about what products have been excluded from TCET, I guess, because I'll make a very specific example to the point that you were making, Donald. If you're it's very different between drugs and devices and diagnostics, right? With a drug or a device in general, to get FDA authorization, you have to effectively show that it is not just safe and effective, but that effectiveness means that there's actually what you could call clinical utility, right? There's usefulness to that product. So that's very different from diagnostics, where obviously just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something with that diagnostic. So there's a difference between being safe and effective and being reasonable and necessary. So I'd love to know what products were sort of carved out, because that nuance, I think, is potentially an important one and an appropriate one, I would argue. The second thing, more generally, is about breakthrough, right? It really gets to things can get breakthrough, but don't actually get final authorization. So how many things that actually get breakthrough actually have gotten final authorization from the FDA and then ultimately coverage and reimbursement from Medicare? And how does that compare to, say, the drug side of the equation, where those things are really linked, right? You get FDA authorization, you get paid. You may not be where you want to be on the formulary, but you'll get paid. So those are my two questions. Thanks.
I can answer the first question. I think, I know there are products in the pipeline that may not have a breakthrough designation that would potentially have significant utility to beneficiaries. So I think that's one area. There could be products that are excluded just because they haven't applied potentially for a breakthrough designation. And I would hope CMS would consider including those products in an expedited pathway. I don't know that I can answer your question about the numbers. I think FDA has put out some information recently about breakthrough products. But I don't know the link there.
And maybe I will just say that the TCET guidance specifically excluded diagnostics, so that was what they did when they did that. And then obviously Congress is getting a lot of pushback on that, and that was some of the things that were talked about at the hearing. Members raised concern with that in a bipartisan way. So just the way they did that, they intentionally excluded that.
I think that second question is definitely probably a question for FDA. I was going to make fun of Assume Pierre is over here, but I won't put him on the spot, because I'm looking around there, I'm like thinking, is there any FDA folks who might be able to answer that question? I don't think Assume probably has the data on that right now. So,
who does diagnosing?
Who does diagnosing? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean CDRH.
No. Who's the person in healthcare that actually diagnosed something?
The person in healthcare who actually diagnosed them, the physician.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's probably why, because if you're talking about TCET and looking at devices, the device cannot by itself, that's a whole different pathway to actually make a diagnosis. The physician does. So it's going to change how you have to go through the process. So to my question about DME.
Could you introduce yourself first?
So
really
Margaret Halstead, Vice President, Health Economics, Market Access with Medline Industries, but I've been in this industry over 30 years. And I can sit at CMS, especially the DME presentation every June and say yes, no, that won't fly, because I can tell that companies unfortunately hire consultants who are not familiar with the DME space. And so they, as you mentioned, knowing exactly how it goes, they actually have a flow chart on the CMS page that when my team comes to me and says, oh, we want to design this and we want to get covered and we want to get reimbursed, and I said, let me explain to you medically necessary reason in the absence of an illness, it wouldn't be needed. Oh, we want to get this covered. Soap. I said, do you need to bathe with soap if you're sick or not? If you're healthy, yeah, it won't be covered. In the absence of an illness, it's not necessary. So the rules are actually there. And so what I find is people don't go take time to learn them well, to know LCD process, the benefits manual. They're actually quite a bit of what being discussed here written, but it's having people who really understand the space. I have been in a couple thousand patients' home. And when I look at design, most companies don't have the patient involved in the process. I had a piece of equipment, and I've been on the Hill lobbying with my one-pager, going to the different, healthcare staff of the different senators and Congress people, and I make it real for them. I paint the picture, like you heard this morning from the FDA, involve the patient. And so when I was able to demonstrate to them real examples of how and why negative pressure is one of the things I can point to, that we were able to bring us something completely new, get it covered, a multi-billion-dollar revenue generating device, because we learned the process and then we followed it. So you have to involve the patient. When you go into a patient's home in a double wide trailer in West Virginia and you have holes in the ground that can't even hold the equipment, or they don't have electricity because the bill doesn't get paid, social determinants of health, good running water, reliable Wi-Fi, all of these things are parts. I would ask you how much of that is taken into consideration when you're designing something for home use, because you can't just take it from a hospital environment, more controlled, and put it in the home and think it's going to be reliable and useful and able to be used the way you intend and to support it. Yeah. I've taken phone calls every hour on the clock, and the patient always says, "Thank you for making me feel normal," because you're going to have a different way of support. We put $500 million into a support center.
I think that's an interesting question, because I've talked to Jeff Shuren over at CDRH about this, and especially in terms of at-home use products. How do you get those products on the market? And the mantra is fit for purpose. So when you're looking at products, it's not just good enough to say this product works. It's kind of like the stuff that works at the hospital, but when you're at home and you don't have a physician, you don't have somebody who's highly trained in how to use that product, it needs to still work effectively. So could you kind of talk about breakthrough devices and how you guys think about addressing some of these disparities that might happen because products may not be really fit for purpose for patients at home?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a first shot at that. As we think about some of the therapeutic areas that we think are ripe for being implemented at home, I think you raised several of the key factors. You really have to involve the patient in that environment early on in your design process. So it's not just about the technology and kind of the data interaction between the physician and the patient. It's interesting, but it ends up being a very non-standardized environment compared to hospitals. Hospitals, kind of wherever you're in the country, kind of look similar. Homes don't. They're all over the place, whether it's access to electricity or many of these are elderly patients where if you walk in and say, okay, listen carefully, you have 14 things you have to do every day to get this to work. They're like, I'm out, right? So there's a simplification dimension. There's a respect that many homes are different. And from our perspective, and we're still in the early stage of this, we actually incorporate a lot of that research and that understanding and that reality in how the product actually gets configured. And another interesting point, the fact that you can deliver it at home doesn't mean every patient ought to get it at home. There's an active dialogue in some of our emerging therapies that say, look, here's the kind of patient that would be successful at home, and here's the kind of patient that wouldn't. And so being able to run your clinical trials and generate evidence that actually, I'll say, clarifies those two groups and amplifies the lines so that when physicians get the product, they know who'd be a great candidate to go home with this therapy and who wouldn't.
Novacure is a DME supplier, and we have a direct relationship with our patients. Our product is the patient starts therapy in their home with a member of our team. So we directly support that work. We visit them regularly and make sure they know how to use it and that they have the supplies they need. And that they are using the therapy effectively. So I appreciate the question. It's a critical part of our mission, and I think we're so focused on those patients.
Akanksha, do you have any insight into that as a physician?
No, I just completely agree. I think the person who can tell you what they need is the person who's going through it, right? All of us may not have had cancer or serious things, but we've all gone through disease. And in that disease process or that illness process, we know this is what I would really need right now to help me feel better. And so I think that point is very well taken. Like in your home, in your experience, that person has to be engaged from the beginning. And I think that that's in healthcare in general, it's changing. And I really am very supportive of that movement, that patient advocates need to be present at the table and compensated for their time and supported from day one, because only then will because there's so many things that have come out that sounded like a great idea, and then you actually put it into the person's home, and it doesn't work. Like, even with Tumor Treating Fields, they're amazing, but number one thing I get is the battery pack is just too heavy, and it's something we feed back to the company, and they're working on it, and we're trying to get changes. But these small day-to-day life things is what's really important.
Thank you. Take your question.
Yeah, hi, I'm Emma. I'm with Inside Health Policy. I have kind of two questions for you guys. One, in terms of this legislative proposal, HR 1691, what are you guys hearing from industry that, like, they kind of want to see in the legislation in terms of, like, key parts of the legislation that industry is really banking on for this kind of legislation to go through? And then secondly, I want to talk a little bit about software as a medical device and digital therapeutics, some of these therapies that have gotten breakthrough designation by FDA, but CMS is really, really struggling with if it can cover them, different ways that it might be able to cover them, and how you guys kind of see either legislative or regulatory solutions to SAMD and digital therapeutics.
I just want to make sure really quick, we only have about 8 minutes left, so I want to get quick answers so that we can get everybody have a chance. So, please.
I'll go quickly, and then Katie had your mic up too. There is a piece of legislation to allow for a separate Medicare payment pathway for prescription digital therapeutics. So that's something that I think was also part of and talked about at the Energy and Commerce hearing. And so that's something that they're looking at, because you're right, CMS has had to this point that they don't think there's a separate way for them to actually cover that. I mean, and it sounds like, you ask people who are talking with them, it seems like there's very much an interest in that, but there's not a clear legal pathway at this point. So enacting that legislation would be very expensive, but that is something that I think that they're looking at on that piece. And then as it relates to big picture, and then I'll let others speak to industry on what people are looking for. I think that process is still sort of midstream, because step one is trying to push them to move the guidance from proposed to final, and how much can you get movement from beginning to end, and then figuring out, based off of where they're going to finalize that rule, what other legislative change do you need to make on top of that. If I were to say, I think the thing that the Hill is hearing the most unified around is there's too few devices, 5 is too few. You need to have more certainty and clarity on what you're looking at to kind of have those 5 be it. There's no enforcement mechanisms for the timelines for CMS to actually do this, and then concern that it's not a distinct and separate pathway. I think those are kind of some of the main things that I've heard. But
No, I think that's right. I wouldn't add anything.
Aligned.
I want to kind of, I know I said really quick. Is user fees for CMS something that would be on the table?
I don't think so. It's a good question. I mean, so we've heard Sir used to talk about the lack of resources. That's obviously what CMS cites for why they say they can only do 5. To put my old Congress hat on for a second, I think there's often, especially when you're looking at how much money you are appropriating for some of the operational functions of CMS, that some members view that there's actually a ton of money, right? That you've put to CMS, and that there's always a hesitancy to give CMS more money, and so it's a fair point. I mean, obviously, one of the industry, right, could kind of circle around and figure out if that's something that there's interest in doing, but I haven't heard a lot of talk about that in Congress.
I'll just go back to when we did it for the FDA. The grand bargain was, we do user fees, you commit to timelines and staffing, and it gets measured and it gets reported out. And in so many things in life, if you end up having the connection between funding, visibility, and commitment and follow-up, just good things happen. So I don't know if it's politically possible, but we saw with FDA, and I'm guessing 20 years it was unthinkable, but we did it, and it was not an easy process. But when we came out of it, I think the FDA would say it's working, and we would say on an industry side, it's become a pretty effective partnership.
Emily? Sorry, Kate.
What I think I have to say is that this question may be a bit above my pay grade.
Fair enough, fair enough.
We're certainly interested in the discussion, but yeah.
I'll take your question.
Quick question, Sharon Wolfington. I'm an investor and board member of multiple companies, 2 of which had breakthrough designation. And I'm curious about an interim pathway before the ruling gets through in this 5-year window, and also collecting data. What is the CMS ruling on direct-to-patient billing if they're government-funded healthcare? Doesn't solve the equal access issue, obviously, but is it an option to do direct-to-patient billing, specifically if it's tied to a medical device, which is what everyone's talking about at this meeting?
In the Medicare program?
Yes. Is it permitted and allowed?
No.
Is that something that we should be looking at as an option to give patients access to things like AI-enabled functionality or patient monitoring apps that go along with the medical device?
I think it's like a direct CMS question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that maybe one that hasn't been. When I first kind of listened to your question, my first thought was many years ago when I worked for a physician member, there was talk about allowing that to happen on the provider side, right? So you could, at the time, people were having trouble getting access to see a Medicare provider if they were in the Medicare program. And so some doctors saying, well, if there was a way to do, again, it's a bad word now, but like balance billing. And there was a major uproar and backlash to anything like that. And I think that there would be some pushback to doing that, but it's not one that I've heard an active conversation on.
I'd be worried that it would just increase the disparities that are already there.
So it's really funny, Vasum preempted me because I really wanted to ask him about pediatrics because, it's all about Medicare, but there is a population that I think we often overlook. So Vasum, go ahead and introduce yourself and ask your question.
No, thank you very much, Danny. And just let me say thank you to all of you for sharing your exceptional insights. I think this conversation is extremely valuable. But Danny, you have now preempted me as well, since we have spent most of this time discussing the older populations and the Medicare populations. When we think about health equity around healthcare altogether, and we break that down into medical devices, at the FDA, we see that there is a growing health inequity between those technologies that are being translated for the benefits of adult populations, and that's a broad category, so I'll keep it there for right now, versus those that are being translated for pediatric populations. And as most of you may know, pediatrics for devices at the FDA is defined as birth all the way to the day before your 22nd birthday. I'll give you some very simple stats very quickly, but devices, especially PMAs and HDEs that are being designed and intended and labeled for adults are growing at a rate about 21 times that of those that are solely for pediatrics, meaning designed, evaluated, labeled just for pediatrics. They're also growing at a rate of about 2.8 to 3 times faster than those that are intended for populations less than 18 years of age. So this is a growing health inequity issue. Regulatory options and policy options that could potentially support innovators to innovate on behalf of children is very important. And when we think about, how do we support innovation, reimbursement makes a significant difference, especially for those small companies and small innovators. Certainly makes a difference for large companies as well. Has there been any, that was a long lead up to this simple question, has there been any conversations, discussions really around how can we start to think about supporting innovation for nearly a quarter of our population, children? They are exposed to a very different benefit risk profile every single day in healthcare when devices are generally and very predominantly used in a quote unquote off-label manner.
Gosh, that's such a good question, and I'm really glad that you raised it. I do think you're absolutely right that it's the payment structures that drive the innovations. And it's really tricky because so many of those children are covered by state Medicaid programs where the coverage challenges are even so much harder, right? And so, we work on this on a day-to-day basis, and I don't know. I'd love to talk to you about that more because I think it's a real problem in need of a solution.
Just a quick one. FDA is very interested in this, and they often approach companies like ours saying, why don't you take one of your products that we know is being used off-label, run a trial, we'll work with you, we'll partner. We do that. But the state Medicaid issue is a real one, and it kind of transcends all the CMS conversations we've been having.
Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. I want to do one really quick thing. I want to get a quick sentence from you folks. What do you want people in this room to take away? If they take nothing else away from this conversation, what do you want them to take away? I'll start with Akanksha.
I think it would be that patients are waiting for these devices, and as we think about these changes in our policy, we really need to think about all patients and not just some patients.
It's a critical time right now in the U.S. policy landscape. There's an opportunity, a real opportunity to do TCET and beyond. We can do more than even that, and that will lead to those patient outcomes.
I'd say become educated and let your voice be heard to your congressman, because much of this is going to get settled there and hopefully build on whatever comes out as a final rule for TCET.
It's hard being last to say it. I do think this is a time where keeping this issue bipartisan and having members of Congress hear from their constituents, patients, and stakeholders on the importance of getting this first step right. It's time to do it.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this talk. Join me in giving these wonderful folks an applause.